Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Have attention, please. All quiet, please. Thank you. Welcome to Friday. Go ahead, have your notes out. We're going to continue on with Nicaragua. First, the revolution. We're going to wrap up the revolution, and then we're going to get into the Civil War. And this thing is going to be all over the place. And during the time that this is going on, during the Cold War, everybody in America, a lot of people in America are like, oh my gosh, you got to pay attention to what's going on in Nicaragua. Write this down. When the Cold War is over, in Nicaragua and a bunch of other places, some with really high consequence like Afghanistan, when the Cold War is over, 1991, a lot of Americans are going to go, huh? Do we need to pay attention to the rest of the world anymore? Or can we go back to not caring about stuff? I mean, this is actually, in Nicaragua, people are going to go, oh, what's going on in Nicaragua? Oh, that person's in charge? Wow. I would have never guessed, but who cares? Other places like Afghanistan, it's going to be a mess. And we're going to be talking about the situation in Afghanistan in this unit. And it is pretty wild, but we'll get to that later. Today, we're going to be continuing on with Nicaragua, with the notes on the Nicaraguan Revolution and Civil War. And we may get back into the CNN Cold War video, episode number 18. Okay? Questions, comments about anything else going on? Okay, I do believe that President Trump now has got his Twitter account back on there because he just tweeted that he is not going to be attending the inauguration, which I think people were kind of suspecting that he wasn't going to attend even before Wednesday's activities. And so, yeah, I've been following kind of what's going on there. Yeah. So, yeah, I want to guess there's one guy in Idaho who no longer has a Facebook account or Instagram account because he did some rappelling. Have you guys ever rappelled? When I went to college, I learned about rappelling. Raise your hand if you can explain what rappelling is. Oh, here we go. Yeah, it's like you climb up and then you come down quickly, but not too quickly, because if you come down too quickly, gravity might harm you. So you're on a rope, and you have a person who hopefully knows what they're doing. They're called the belayer, right? And so you're up at the top, and you say, belay. I think that's how it works. Belay, and then the person below says belay on, as in they are going to safely let out enough rope so you can come down safely. I literally, when I was at William & Mary, I took a class because they wanted you to do PE classes rather than just like straight academic. Shh. I'm telling you about my days at William & Mary. Shh. And so we had to take 4 athletic classes, and I did whitewater canoeing on the lake at William & Mary. It was really cool. And I did a class called Adventure Games, and we literally we played war out in the swamp area where it was really cool. And then we also learned how to do rock climbing, belaying, and so forth. Well, there was, long story short, there was a guy who graduated from Mountain View High School some years ago who was recognized by one of his classmates. Keep this in mind, your classmates recognize you. So if you post stuff, and I guess they were in contact over the years, but he posted some stuff saying, I'm in Nancy Pelosi's chair. He actually was in Mike Pence's chair. He didn't understand, I guess, the difference between the Senate chambers and the House chambers. He broke into the gallery of the Senate chambers and rappelled down into the floor of the Senate and then perched himself in the chair. So those images, and because he posted it, and those images are they're there. And I'm sure federal investigators are now thinking, what can we charge him? This guy is pulling all back because he's I'm sure he's hearing from people around him going, I think you took it a little bit too far this time, fella. Okay? It's one thing to be in support of Donald Trump for President of the United States. It's a totally different thing to break into the Capitol building and rappel down onto the floor of the Senate and sit in Mike Pence's chair. And of course, in his defense, he was telling other people, don't break stuff, which is great, when you break into a 7-Eleven and so forth, make sure you tell your co-conspirators, don't break anything. We're just here for the experience, But yeah, it was kind of embarrassing because I'm sure there were some people around him like, dude, you went on a mission for 2 years and you attended like college and stuff, and you're trying to start a business as a young man here in Idaho during COVID times, probably you should have thought that through a little bit more carefully as how this is going to play out. Because, I mean, it's tough. You guys are living in a time period where there's not as much opportunity to like make stupid mistakes as a young person. Okay? Because it's like captured. And there will be people who are like, oh, let's do a little background check on so-and-so. Anyway, so, yeah. Well, I mean, people, I don't think that, I mean, after all, you know, some of them are like, well, we got encouragement from, not me, but they got encouragement from, you know, the speakers at their rally, including one person who said, yeah, march on up to the Capitol building and tell those sons of guns or whatever, you know, that they're, yeah. So, yeah, late last night, I guess President Trump did issue a video basically saying, you know, that that's wrong, condemning the, you know, the break-in and so forth and so on. And I was reading, it's like, you know, is he afraid that, like, somebody's going to prosecute him? Because if you tell people to do something, that's free speech. But if you tell them to do something that is, yeah, then you could be held accountable for what you said. Your First Amendment free speech only goes in so far. It's kind of like, you know, you hear the examples. You can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater because that could cause a riot. You can't tell a bunch of people with guns waving, hey, there's the enemy, go shoot him. And then go, well, I didn't shoot him. You know, so you have to be very responsible with your words. Yeah, and so like, and here one of the women who was associated with President Trump's campaign, I think more of the legal aftermath where they were challenging things in the courts and so forth, was making all kinds of claims about like Dominion Voting Machine Company or so forth. I mean, they're a business that does, among other things, voting machines, and she was saying like this, that, and so forth. And the people of that company are like, you have defamed us and you have harmed our reputation and we're having a hard time with our business, so therefore she got sued today for like $3 billion, you know. And, you know, I mean, you're not going to get the money, but in the lawsuit you'll have an opportunity to say, this is what our company does. Okay, now you bring forth all that evidence you were talking about how our company is involved in fraudulent, you know, illegal activities and yada, yada, yada. Oh, you don't have that. Oh, well, in that case, then you lose that case. They'll never be able to get $3 billion from her, but they want to reestablish the reputation of that company, okay? Which, you know, because they're in a business, and they got whipsawed during the whole thing having to do with the election as far as like what the actual results were. Yeah, we got some crazy elections going on. We'll talk about some elections and so forth in Nicaragua. You guys ready for the Nicaragua situation? All right, let's do this. All right. Try. Yeah, no, follow along. It's a fascinating story, and it's taking place in the midst of the Cold War. Okay, the United States, even before the Cold War, we were always interested in what was going on in Latin America, right? We got business interests there. So the Somoza family, they're in charge of Nicaragua before the Cold War, and they're in charge of Nicaragua as we enter the Cold War, okay? And this is the last of the Somozas, Anastasio Somoza. Tara, why is President Nixon standing next to Anastasio Somoza in that particular situation? What, are they getting along pretty well?
No.
What does Nixon like about Somoza? He's a leader. Is he one of our kind of leaders? Yeah. Yeah, he's got power. Do we like him because he was freely elected in a non-corrupt situation? No, because he wasn't freely elected in a non-corrupt situation. Is he a good example of democracy and protection of human rights? No. Is he anti-communist? Ding, 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 ding. That's the one. Yes. Woo! So we got him. Yeah. So he's anti-communist. And the people who are opposed to him, all right? On. Here we go. Not this guy, because this guy's dead, but his name carries on in the Sandinistas. Okay? And the leader of the Sandinistas is Daniel Ortega. And they start getting involved in military activities. They form up in 1961. Make sure you have this down. In the 1970s, they're getting more and more active, right? Where do they get some of their support from, Jacob? Daniel Ortega. Where does he get some of his support from for his activities trying to overthrow the Somoza government? Castro, okay? And then, therefore, perhaps indirectly from Soviet Union, yeah. So, I mean, that's part of that team. Trenton, do you remember the other unique way that the Sandinistas sometimes do fundraising? Steal people. Yeah, kidnapping, ransom, stuff like that. Yeah, so, I mean, it's like, you know, and they would justify going, well, those guys are bad. And then you're like hearing echoes in your mind of your parents going, well, two wrongs do not make a right. Right, you know? And it's really tough because in the Cold War, you know, President Nixon's going, those guys are those guys are communists and so forth. We need to support these guys. And other people are coming along going, really? But that makes us look bad, right? I mean, if you defend your friend in a fight, do you look good? You're like, well, wait a minute. Let me say I'm loyal. I'm defending a friend. What if your friend is a really bad, horrible person who started the fight and beat some little kid up trying to steal their candy, right? And Livy's like, that's my friend. Get away, kid. Give me your candy. Yeah, yes, go ahead. Here we go. Shh. We need to move forward on this. The Sandinistas would like to overthrow the government of Somoza, institute such leftist policies as, and very popular policies among the poor as, land reform, exactly, right, redistribute and so forth. But here's an interesting thing, because if you look at that, what kind of government, if they're getting a lot of support from Castro, what kind of government might they set up? Might they set up a democratically elected situation? Or might it be a left-wing dictatorship? It could be a left-wing dictatorship, and that's where Nixon is concerned, because then you have another foothold in the Americas for Soviet bases and things like that. Yeah. I talked about that in general, and when we get to other situations, there may have been some of that, but don't put that down necessarily specifically for Nicaragua. When we get to like Afghanistan and so forth, definitely. There is going to be a lot of poppies grown and harvested for the purpose of raising money. Yeah, the LSD fundraising, proposal. Okay? Yeah, all right, now in the midst of this, all right, so we've got some fighting going on in the early 70s. This is an important event, all right? Ready to write this down. 1972 in Nicaragua. 1972 in Nicaragua. This event happens. And it isn't necessarily, this is not a partisan event. It doesn't favor the Sandinistas or Somoza, but it happens. And it happens while, let me see, 1972, who's in charge of Nicaragua? Somoza. It's a massive earthquake. Write it down. A massive earthquake. It's called an earthquake. I don't know, do we name earthquakes? I don't think we do. I mean, do we call it like the Nicaraguan earthquake or something? I don't know. It may have a name and so forth. If you looked it up, Nicaragua, they go, oh, of course, that's the earthquake. You know, we name hurricanes, but I don't think we name earthquakes. Unless there is like a specific place, the epicenter. Anyway, so here's the deal. Earthquakes can be very, very devastating. They can cause all kinds of harm, and this one did. It really, killed a lot of people, and it broke a lot of stuff, and it's really hard for a country to recover from that. Here's what you need to know about natural disasters. When they happen, the government in charge has a responsibility to help out the people as much as they possibly can. And if the government says, well, it's not our fault that the earthquake happened, you have poor, starving people looking and going, well, you suck, government, because we're dying here. Hurricane Katrina. This is probably before any of you guys don't have a memory of Hurricane Katrina. Do you? Okay, because it was a big hurricane. It hit New Orleans. It was devastating. It happened during the time of President George W. Bush. And there was a lot of criticism of George W. Bush. Did he cause the hurricane? No. but people looked to him and the federal government and state government and local government to help out the people in the aftermath. And to the extent that there were people who were suffering after the hurricane and so forth, then some of those people blamed Bush. Well, write this down, because this is a key thing. The Somoza regime has a hard time dealing with the after effects of the earthquake. And it will make their job remaining or maintaining popularity among the people very hard. Is there anybody that's very quick to point out and go, you suck, Somoza, you can't take care of the people, you should be taking care of them after this earthquake and you're not doing it? Answer? Sandinistas, yeah, and obviously in Castro and so forth helping them out that way. Okay? And so things are getting, this is going to be one of the things that's going to be taking place in the midst of this fight. The Sandinistas are ramping it up as far as their violent activities. How does Somoza respond? Well, how do you respond? If you got, with violence, violence begets violence. And Somoza uses torture, murder, intimidation, etc. against clear enemies, but of course it's always difficult because some of the people who are opposing Somoza are like, they don't want to be identified as an enemy, so they try to keep a low profile. And so Somoza's like, well, I know you're an enemy, I'm going to identify you are. So there's a lot of people who are getting caught in the middle. Okay? Now, one institution that exists in Nicaragua that tried to maintain an even keel and a fair thing was the newspaper called La Prensa. Okay? This is one of the main newspapers, La Prensa. Okay? And the editor of that newspaper is Pedro Chamorro. So, in the midst of this, you got a dictator and so forth, who is using censorship. So make sure there's no question about it. He's using censorship because he doesn't want to give his opponents an opportunity to espouse criticism against him. But of course, what is the responsibility of a free, objective press, news media? To report accurately on what is going on, which is always a bit of a challenge. And I encourage you in your lives to get a sprinkling of news media sources, because in this country, I don't know that there's any one source you can always turn to for complete 100% objectivity. For news reporting, okay, yeah, for news reporting, okay, yeah, okay. So, but here's the deal. Chamorro, okay, apparently was somewhat critical in he's the top editor at that newspaper, and apparently he was somewhat critical of Somoza's regime. And so on January 1st, 1979, write it down, January 1st, 1979, he's murdered. And it looks like he's murdered by people associated with Somoza's regime, which kind of makes sense because this guy is now, well, he's not Sandinista. Understand that. He's not Sandinista. He's from the news media, and he's looking at everything going on, and he's like, Somoza, yeah, the Sandinistas are against you, and they're doing this and this and this, but you're also doing murder, torture, intimidation, and censorship, and so forth, so you're not doing very good either, right? I mean, nobody looks good in this particular thing, and this guy is dead. Okay? Now, what happens after that? Well, the Sandinistas look and go, well, he wasn't necessarily with us, but to the extent that he was criticizing Somoza, we like him. And therefore, since he's dead, let's use that as an opportunity. So they call for a general strike. Write it down. A general strike. They call for a general strike in the country. And so a lot of people are very upset. Sandinistas are like, yeah, this is working out pretty well for us. Raise your hand if you can tell me another thing. Look very carefully at the date, 1978. Something else is already in existence by 1978 with respect to who's got Somoza's back. Does America still have... No. Where is Richard Nixon still president in 1978? He resigned in 1974. Is Gerald Ford, Nixon's vice president, who then became president, is he still president? Who's the President of the United States? What did we tell you, Julian, already about Jimmy Carter with respect to... Yeah, he likes human rights, and so he has not been very impressed with what Somoza's been doing. And so Jimmy Carter is like, man, Somoza, you've really messed things up here, and I'm not going to help you out, dude. I am not going to help you out. Okay? So the tide has definitely turned against Somoza. The following year will see him defeated ultimately. Ready? Write this down. 1979. In 1979, you get a number of things happening. First, early 1979, an organization called the OAS. I want you to write that down. The OAS. It's called the Organization of American States. And so literally, if you were to look at the Organization of American States, it's pretty much like all of these countries in the Caribbean, in South America, Central America, including the United States and Canada. It's almost like a little mini UN just for the American states. And they're trying to play a role to end the conflict in Nicaragua. And so here's their idea. They say, hey, you know what would be a good idea? How about free elections? How about some free elections, you know? Like, we'll have international observers come in, you know, and, you know, kind of like my dad did when he went to Palestine and also in Ukraine. Watch and see that the election process is free and fair and so forth, right? Who might be in favor of that between Somoza versus Ortega? Ortega might be in favor of that because he feels like the tide is kind of on his side. He's got a lot of popularity. What about Somoza? What do you think, Frank? Is Somoza going to be like, yeah, I'm going to put myself up for a vote? No. It's a hard no. Write that down. He says no. No. A free election, he's afraid that he's done enough things. And of course, you know, you still have this aftermath of the earthquake that didn't work out very well for him. So he's like, no. And he sizes up the situation, sees that he's not going to be able to maintain power, doesn't have the U.S. supporting him anymore. Things are turning against him. So, write it down. July 17, 1979, he quits. July 17, 1979, Somoza resigns. And I don't have it in my notes here, but I'm guessing. What would you think, Landon? What advice would you give to Somoza after he resigned as president of Nicaragua? Stick around or what? Probably get out, and I think they did. It's interesting as far as like different locations that like overthrown dictators and so forth go to. Saudi Arabia seems to be a favorite destination and whatnot. But yeah, it says so he's gone. So who's in charge now of Nicaragua? The Sandinistas, Daniel Ortega. And there you go. He gets invited to the White House. Jimmy Carter. Well, who's we? Are you the American that speaks in total uniformity for the American opinion? Carter's okay, because Carter looks and he goes, this guy's got to be better than Somoza. And he seems to have more popular support. And, you know, people will advise Carter goes, this guy's not like squeaky clean on human rights. And by the way, have you looked at who his like best buddy is? Castro? And Castro's not cool on human rights either. They don't have free and fair elections in communist Cuba. Yeah. Who? Carter didn't get him in power. Carter just backed off and let things play out. Because, and that's a very good answer, very good question. The answer probably is because Jimmy Carter cares a lot about human rights. And Somoza's human rights record going way back was not good. In that particular situation. Yeah. But here's the point. Because Jimmy Carter is going to be defeated in an election in 1980 running for president again. Happened to Trump, happened to George H.W. Bush, happened to Jimmy Carter. One-term presidents who beat Jimmy Carter in the November election of 1980. And this is important because this is going to be a key thing with respect to the Civil War. What year was the presidential election? 1980. Yeah, 1980. I graduated from high school in 1981. I wasn't old enough because I turned 18 in August of 1981, but some of my buddies were able to vote because they'd already turned 18. So this is like some of you guys, you were able, which one of you guys were able to vote in this last election, right? So yeah, because you guys turned 18 already. So that was the situation. And so, you know, Reagan ran against Carter, and write this down, Trenton, everybody. Reagan was very critical of this. Reagan's like, Carter, you're cozying up to our enemy. You should not be inviting the Sandinista leader because he's like, you know, part and parcel of Castro. He's not a good guy. The communists are bad. You need to deal tough with the communists. You know, granted, human rights are very important, but, you know, number one, communism. It's bad. We've got to crack down on it. You got that? So you ready for the next part? The next part is the Civil War, 1981 to 1990. The Nicaraguan Civil War. Good grief. What, do they get 1 year off not being in war? That's about it. We go from the Nicaraguan Revolutionary War, which took a lot of years to actually get fully started. We got that wrapped up, and now we're going to go into a Civil War period. Okay, this is the 1980s. And one thing we should know right at the get-go, and this is important, I'm glad you asked that question, Trenton, because Reagan's got a very different view of Ortega. Very different. This is, yeah, in fact, Time Magazine cover here, the man who makes Reagan see red. Reagan's like, this is not okay. We should have done more to prevent this guy from coming into power. Now that he is in power, let's see if we can identify. Now, it's always an interesting thing because rather than just send in U.S. forces to overthrow a popular leader of a country, if we can identify people, I mean, that was the whole thing behind the Bay of Pigs. Who landed on the beaches of Cuba on the Bay of Pigs in 1961? Cuban exiles. Did they have enough support from the United States of America? Not really. Reagan, write this down, Reagan wants to identify Nicaraguans who are not happy with the Sandinistas and Ortega. And he wants to give them support. And who are those people going to be? Let's write them down. They're going to be known as the Contras. Well, yeah, I mean, it was an internal war. Yeah. Sandinistas, they were engaged in a military fight against the government of Somoza. And they won. Yeah, I mean, Somoza eventually, like, got out of there. It was kind of like, you don't remember all the crazy stuff was going on in the Mexican Revolution? Where it was like, war! And then the people who were on the same side were now on the opposite side. And it's like, and then somebody got killed, and then there was revenge, and it was like, This has got pretty clearly two distinct phases. Okay? Now we're in the opposition to the Sandinistas phase. And who are the local Nicaraguans that are opposed to Ortega? The Contras. Well, who are the Contras? Okay? The Contras are people who do not like the strong leftist tendencies of Ortega. And if you want, I mean, you don't have to go too far in Central America to find people who don't like really hard left ideology. Think of this. Raise your hand if you can tell me. What is one institution that a lot of people like in Latin America that is not communist? Yeah. Catholic Church, yeah. Catholic Church. And sometimes the Catholic Church, it's interesting when you look at it depending on who that is, but sometimes the Catholic Church can be kind of a basis of being sort of very traditional and very conservative. And so it's fascinating because you can look at a Nicaraguan peasant and go, well, what are you? Are we the Sandinistas or the Contras? If they lean a little bit to the left, they may be with the Sandinistas. If they lean a little bit more on their religious beliefs, maybe they're with the Contras. But make sure you understand this. It looked like the government that Ortega had set up was not being free and fair and open. It looked like it was going to be more like a Cuban government, right? I mean, surprise, surprise, you replace a right-wing dictatorship with, wow, who would have saw that coming? I mean, that happens sometime in history. You really have to, like, get over yourself to, like, bring in free, fair principles like democracy. It's not easy, if you've been through dictatorship, to set up a democracy. That's why I've gone over and over every year since I began teaching. It's incumbent upon you guys to keep our democracy going, because it can be very fragile this week. And you don't want it to go the other direction, because you guys remember when we did the Spanish Civil War? I mean, that was like that was nasty. And I mean, when did they finally get democracy? Years. I mean, it was after Franco died. And even then, it took a little bit to make sure that it was going to stick hold. I mean, it was kind of embarrassing, honestly, because the world was looking at what was going on in the United States, and they were like, wow, shame, shame, shame. And the most prominent, well-respected European leader criticizing the United States on the behavior that was taking place was from Germany, which tells you how far Germany has come from, you know, their darkest period. Yeah, so let's kind of get this thing turned around and, like, you know, do it right. But anyway, during the Cold War, it's a little bit hard because it gets complicated. Okay, let me go through and tell you. Is President Reagan going to send down military force directly? No, make sure you write that down. We are not going to send down military force directly. Okay? Because that doesn't look too good. And besides, people are like, oh, we don't want another Vietnam. And I'm like, okay. So what kinds of things can President Reagan do, and his supporters that want to help out the Contras to overthrow this leftist government? Give money and weapons to the Contras. Write that down. U.S. money and weapons to the Contras. And we can funnel that through neighboring countries. This is where it's very important. At the get-go of this, raise your hand if you can identify 3 neighboring Central American countries that have right-wing dictators that the United States can funnel support for the Contras and actually do training and so forth. Guatemala, write it down. Guatemala is one. Okay, that's going to be a very important one. Guatemala is a little bit, it's not directly next to Nicaragua, but that's one. Honduras, write that down. That's going to be probably one of the biggest ones. Honduras. Okay, so Contras are going to train, be given weapons and support through Honduras. And then there was one other, not Panama, El Salvador. Very good, El Salvador. Okay, all 3 of those have, like, right-wing dictatorship friendly governments to the United States of America at that time, so we're getting our support through there. Well, this is the United States of America. And as this is going on, some of the people in the United States of America are going, I don't think we should be doing this. I think we should just let the Nicaraguan people, like, solve it themselves. And of course, the counter response is, yeah, that'd be nice if they're free and fair elections, but there's not. So we get into this big debate, and it kind of goes this way and that way. You ready? Write it down. Boland Amendment, named after the representative, I forget which state he was from, but they called it the Boland Amendment because it was an amendment to an appropriation bill over several years. Basically, here's what it says. United States, President Reagan, no money for the Contras. No U.S. money for nothing. Taking weapons, you know, food, medical supplies. No, the Boland Amendment from 1982 all the way to 1985. It was in those 82, 83, 84, and 85. It was in those appropriations budgets that the official position of the United States government, according to Congress, was stay out of the war. Do not put U.S. money into the war. So if President Reagan was funneling money during that time period, would he be in violation of the law? Yes. He didn't like the Boland Amendment. Okay? But apparently there was enough support, at least during those particular years, for Congress to overcome any objection that the president had. Do you understand that? Okay? But notice it stopped in 85. After 85, they were able to get some more money going to the Contras for various different things. Okay? One of the weirdest things, of course, was, you ready? Listen very carefully to this because it's a little complicated and it's really weird and it's actually going to blow up and almost get Reagan kicked out of office. It's called the Iran-Contra scandal. You're like, what the heck does Iran have to do with anything? Well, I will tell you. I gave it a little bit of a hint of this last time. The United States and Iran were not getting along with each other like in the late 70s and throughout the 80s, and we're still not getting along with them, okay? They took our embassy personnel hostage and held them for 444 days throughout the duration of Carter's presidency. They didn't release them until actually Ronald Reagan took the oath of office on January 20th, 1981. And I remember that because my mom and I were driving because I was at that inauguration. Didn't you see me? Didn't I show you the picture? I'll show that to you later. No, yeah. Yeah, but yeah, so it was weird because we knew on the news that like probably the hostages were going to be released that day. And they were, right? Because some people are like, oh, Iran's afraid what Reagan might do because Reagan he's a different kind of a person than Jimmy Carter. In any event, you know, give credit to the Carter administration from getting those guys, the hostages, freed, but the Iranians stuck it in Carter's eye by not freeing them until actually Ronald Reagan was sworn in. But our conflict with Iran continued on. Here's one of the things Iran did throughout the 1980s. They had their little terrorist support groups here, there, and so forth, and they would take people hostage, including Americans, in the Middle East, in places like Beirut and other places in the Middle East. They would take them hostage. They're like, what the heck? What, did they need money? Yes. What, were they engaged in a big war? Yes, we'll get to it later. There's a war called the Iran-Iraq War. Whoa, do you know the difference between the two? Well, you will. Those two countries were fighting a long war in the 1980s, and Iran needed money, and they needed supplies, like replacement parts for like sophisticated military aircraft that they had from the United States when the United States was supporting the previous Iranian government. Anyway, it's kind of complicated, but a communication was formed between Reagan's White House and the Iranian government. Very, very secret. Because Reagan's position was, we're not going to negotiate with terrorists or holding people hostage, but we did. And what did the Iranians want? They wanted the replacement parts. Sophisticated, like aircraft replacement parts, because they were fighting a war against Iraq. So, we sold them those parts. And in exchange for money, and the hostages were freed. And of course, when the hostages were freed, everyone's like, oh, the Iranians backed down, yay, haha. Not everyone knew the full, real story, what was going on. And of course, it gets even weirder. Because here's the Reagan administration now, part of it, he's got this big stack of money, and Reagan wasn't completely aware of this. It was sort of done like in one of the offices of the White House by a guy whose name was Oliver North. Hold on. Just let me, you see where we're going here. So we've got this stash of cash, and Oliver North, who was working in the White House for Reagan, perhaps unbeknownst to Reagan, I mean, that was the story. Reagan didn't really know what was going on. Oliver North was like, yeah, he funneled that money to, guess who? Go ahead, McKinley, say it. Not the Sandinistas, no. The Contras, yeah, the Contras. So they funneled the money to the Contras to help the Contras. And when that stuff finally came out on the news, that was not good. Okay? Reagan's defense was, I really didn't know about it, but I should have, and therefore I apologize. I should have done a better job on it. And people are like, oh, that's cool. Okay? Yeah, Oliver North was the guy who, yeah. So, yeah, the Contras. So then, here's probably one of the kicker things. The tide started turning in favor of the Contras as we go through the 1980s. Okay? They're getting some key supplies. And here's what they do. The Contras, by 1987, Okay, the Iran-Contra affair is in 1987. By 1988, 1989, the Contras have put mines in the harbors of the port cities going into and out of Nicaragua. Now let's just see, why is that important? Raise your hand, anybody. Why would that be important? Yeah. Nicaragua can't trade with anybody. Put that down. The fact that the Contras, with a little bit of help, were able to put mines in the harbors of Nicaragua. No country is going to trade with Nicaragua because their harbors aren't safe. Puts a lot of pressure on the Ortega government. And of course the irony is here, this is starting to wrap up by like 1989. By 1989, the Contras are successful. They get, write it down in your notes, it's called the Tela Accord. They get the Tela Accord, which basically means no more fighting. Both sides demobilize. What? What do the Contras get out of these guys? Here's what they get. They get a free and fair election in 1990. I will say that again. The war, in a sense, ends in 1989 because the Contras have been successful at crippling the economy of Nicaragua. How do they cripple the economy of Nicaragua? The Contras are the ones President Reagan definitely supports. Okay? And they've crippled the Nicaraguan economy. Ortega's like, oh my gosh, what do I have to do in order to get our economy safe again so that there's no more mining of the harbors? Answer, agree to free and fair elections. Tela Accord. T-E-L-A. Tela Accord. Didn't I put that in there? I didn't. Yeah, sorry. T-E-L-A. Yeah, the Tela Accord. Yeah, no, it's there. It's at the top of page 2. Okay? Top of page 2. Okay? And so here's the weird thing. Here's the irony. What do the Contras get out of it? They get a free and fair election. And who is the most popular person that's going to run for president and is going to be elected against Daniel Ortega? Violeta Barrios de Chamorro. Does that name sound sort of familiar? No, she's not into churros. Her husband was the murdered editor of La Prensa. Yeah. So she inherited a lot of popularity from a lot of different people. The Contras were like, she's our person. And so she won. And yeah. Wow. A free and peaceful transfer of power from Ortega back to this person. She's not like a Contra fighter. She's just like a very well-beloved person in Nicaragua. And guess what happened after they had that election? They had more elections. Oh my gosh, they're like a full-fledged democracy. And guess who was hanging around going, you know what? Things were pretty good when our guys were in charge. This guy came back and was elected in his own. He's the current president of Nicaragua. Are you guys concerned about that? That Castro's dead and the Cold War is over and who cares? Yeah, I mean, this guy came back. Yeah, I mean, who allowed for the free and fair elections of 1990? Ultimately, he did. Did that ultimately come in his favor? Yeah, he just had. Yeah, he's like, you don't have to be a dictator to be president. You could actually win in a free and fair election. You don't have to do mob rule or anything like that. If you want to be president again, just do it the right way. Wow. Yeah, I've got a couple of videos. I will play you the Family Guy one, and I'll play you another one, and then we'll get into the the last part of the CNN Cold War, episode 18. Okay? Did you guys understand it? I mean, it took some weird turns. Yeah, especially with the IranContra stuff.
I didn't have to remember 50 names.
Ortega, Chamorro, Contra, Boland, Chamorro. Sandinistas? Good. Yeah, I mean, you can do it. Yeah. And we're not going to bring up lots of other, we are going to bring up other people from Central America as well. Dag Hammarskjöld, Yash. Yeah, you can do that one. That'll be fine.